Are you kidding me? Really? I should have been on there. It's the word cosmos. We get lots of words from that. We get cosmetology. We get cosmopolitan.
Cosmetics.
Cosmetics. Really, we do.
James chapter.
But it's commonly in the New Testament, it's translated, or it means the fallen, sinful world system. So when we talk about the cosmos today, what would the cosmos be? It would be this fallen world that we live in. This world and which, everything sinful is now acceptable. It's woke. It's transgender. It believes that we should have abortion on demand. That is the cosmos in which we live. So he secondly says the tongue also corrupts or defiles the person. We're in James 3. Who speaks wrongly. And I have notes back there. Rebecca, notes back there. It corrupts or defiles the person who speaks wrongly. And so it doesn't just damage others, as in gossip. So, when you gossip against somebody, guess what? You are damaging the other person. But you're also doing what to yourself? You're defiling yourself. And then thirdly, he says it sets on fire the course of existence. Now, what does that mean? Well, there was a belief in the ancient world that the goddess Fortune controlled the cycles of life, death, and reincarnation, and the rises and fall of circumstances in each person's life. And you probably heard people say, well, you had good fortune, right? That's kind of a residual effect of that belief. Whatever James is drawing on this, whether James is drawing on this philosophical background is debatable. I prefer to understand what he is saying a bit more simply as in the whole course of our existence. Sometimes we talk about, you might remember The Lion King. Remember The Lion King?
Yes, absolutely. No.
Remember the circle of life from The Lion King? In other words, the tongue wreaks havoc and corrupts a person's entire life. And then fourthly, he says it is a fire, it is set on fire by hell. Now, the word translated hell here in verse 6 is the, anybody want to take let's see if we get 100% on this.
Shield.
What's the Greek word for hell?
Helios.
No?
Hades.
No?
Shield.
No? That's Hebrew. That's Hebrew for death. It's the word, how many of you have heard the word Gehenna used?
Oh, yes.
Ooh.
Yeah, you've probably heard the word Gehenna. Now, and that is an Aramaic, actually, term. So that was really unfair. That's not a Greek term. It's really Aramaic. But it literally refers to the valley of Gehenna, which is Aramaic, which is outside of Jerusalem. And it was a place that was stigmatized in Jesus' day because, you remember child sacrifice to Molech in the Old Testament? Remember that? That was where it was practiced. So they did child sacrifice to Molech at this place. And by the time of Jesus and the time of James, guess what Gehenna was? It was a dump. It was a garbage dump. And it burned continually. Remember Jesus said where the fire never goes out and the flame never dies. And so I don't know if you've ever seen a dump or lived near a dump, but there are always fires in a dump. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, because in the little town where I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., our town was right next door to the county dump. And so we would have dump trucks come and dumping stuff all the time there. And so I used to explore the dump a lot. Number one, it stunk. Number two, you had rats all over the place. And number three, there were always fires burning all over the place. So anyway.
Did you find any treasures?
They were back then. They wouldn't be now. But yeah, but we used to explore the dump, and of course that was forbidden to do, by the way. Mm-hmm. But the fires never go out. And figuratively, Gehenna means hell. And whenever Jesus spoke of hell in the Gospels, it's this word that he uses here, Gehenna, this garbage dump. To illustrate the fact that in hell, the fire never goes out. Any questions? All right. Verse 7. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by man. So James now moves to an analogy from the realm of wild animals to describe the out-of-control nature of the tongue. Now, James is not saying that every single animal in the world has been tamed by man. I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? We have lion tamers, but I don't know how tame those lions are. But think of a Bengali tiger. Can you tame a tiger? Can you tame a shark? I don't think so. But what he is saying, I think, is that every kind of animal out of the following groups have been subdued. Verse 8, but no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. So, whereas humanity has been able to subjugate and domesticate all manner of wild animals, no one has ever mastered the tongue. And I'll tell you, we have a cat at our house, Winston Churchill, and my wife probably will not appreciate, me sharing this, but he's supposed to be domesticated. But I'm going to tell you, he's a wild animal. Mm-hmm. He does what he wants to, and he manipulates human beings. So anyway. The translation that's, the NIV says restless evil. I don't know what you have in your translations, but that's probably not the best translation. Does anybody have a different translation other than restless evil?
Unruly evil?
Unruly evil. Anything else? I think that's a better translation, Bruce. The idea that James is trying to convey is that it is uncontrollable. It can also mean unstable. When you think of unstable, you might think of something like dynamite, right? Anybody ever have to handle dynamite before? Okay.
I got 6 kids, Bob.
There you go. Anyway, the image of the tongue being full of deadly poison, the metaphor suggests a serpent that is ready to strike. And I don't know if any of you have been, have anybody here, probably not, but have any of you ever been bitten by a poisonous snake before? No, okay. I've been bitten by a snake before, but not a poisonous snake. So, anyway, verse 9. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in God's likeness. So James here finally tells us the major problem that makes the tongue so evil. And that is its duplicity. You see, we bless the Lord. You know, here we are in church today, right? And we bless the Lord, we worship and all that stuff, and then we go home, and what do? We slander our neighbor. You know, one of the favorite meals on Sunday afternoon after church? Roast preacher. I can't believe he said that. He was stepping on my toes. You know, you ever do that? Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind about people, no matter how vile and evil and trashy those people may be, guess what? They are made in the image of God. Now, next time you go to Walmart, right? And I don't know if you ever go to Walmart and enjoy the fashion show. Just remember, that 400-pound lady wearing her house slippers is made in the image of God. It's hard to believe, isn't it? But it's true. And despite the fall of Adam and Eve, these people still retain vestiges of the divine image. Now, that might be hard to find. Where was the divine image in a Charles Manson? Or an Adolf Hitler? Or Stalin or Lenin? But they still retain the image of God. And we need to remember that when we talk about people. So when we curse a fellow human being, whether it's a Christian or not, what we are doing in reality is we are cursing the reflection of God in that person. Verse 10. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. Now, what a sad contradiction this is. And James denounces it. He says it should not be so. James says that we shouldn't be capable of both blessing and cursing with the same mouth. And yet we do it, don't we? And furthermore, this type of behavior has no place in the Christian community. Like Jesus, James insists that what comes from our mouth tells us what is in our hearts. It's an illustration of what is in our hearts. And so what comes from our mouth tells us what we really are, doesn't it? Have you ever said something, oh, I let that slip. I didn't really mean that. Have you ever done that before? You didn't let it slip. It may have come out, but it's exactly what you felt. You just didn't want anybody to know that you felt that way. And so, it illustrates our hearts. Verse 11. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? Now, to illustrate just how abnormal this is, being able to curse somebody and bless God, or bless somebody and then curse another person. James again turns to an illustration from nature. You notice how he uses a lot of illustrations from nature? Here our mouths are compared to springs of water. Now, I don't know, how many of you have ever gotten fresh water from a fresh spring? Anybody? Okay, where I went to school, I went to the Capital Bible Seminary, and it used to be, it was the Washington Bible College and the Capital Bible Seminary, and it was like 63 acres. It was on a former monastery that the Roman Catholics sold for some reason. But there was a fresh spring on that water that was always putting forth water. And you know what I used to do? I used to get milk jugs, and I would go down there and I would fill these milk jugs. And so we had fresh spring water at home. It was really nice. Fresh spring water really tastes good. There was also a spring close to where I grew up. It was in the Fort Lincoln Cemetery, and it was a place where George Washington used to get fresh water at this spring. But anyway, that's a digression. But a spring is being compared here to the mouth, or springs of water is being compared to the mouth. Now, a spring can gush forth either fresh water or brackish water, or whatever. But it cannot produce both. Now, I was looking at these notes last night, and I Googled this. And, you know, Google's a great thing if you are into computers at all, because you can put in there, I just put in there a question. Can a spring produce both fresh water and salt water? Here's the answer that Google gave. And that's almost scriptural, isn't it? Google. No spring of water pours out sweet water and bitter water from the same opening. So I take that as gospel.
You're quoting the Bible.
Well, I'm actually quoting Google.
No, I mean, but Google's quoting the Bible.
Maybe they are. But anyway,
Different translation.
so it's my understanding that in the natural world, you can't have a spring that brings forth brackish water and sweet water. It's just an impossibility. There is no spigot on a natural spring that allows us to go back and forth. Okay? Verse 12. My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Now, I used this illustration a few weeks ago, didn't I? About, if you say that you are an apple tree, right? Remember that? And you bring forth pears, for example. You've got a problem, right? You have an identity problem. Because let me tell you, if you're giving forth pears, guess what? You're not an apple tree. I hate to break it to you. That's the analogy that's being used here. Can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? And then he reinforces his point. Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. So James then concludes this section with a string of analogies to show the ridiculous nature of the tongue. A fig tree cannot produce olives, and a grapevine cannot produce figs. No, nature must be true to itself. It must be true to itself. Likewise, a salt spring cannot produce fresh water. And so what he is saying here, and that's all he's saying here, is that we need to be careful in our speech. We need to be careful what we say. In other words, we ought to put a bridle on our tongue. Now, James is not asking for perfection in our behavior, but what he is asking for is consistency in our behavior. And so if you're here praising God today, don't go home and tomorrow curse your neighbor. Now, I think we can take from this the danger, because he was talking about teachers, remember? The danger that some teachers face today. There, unfortunately, is a kind of hero worship that some well-known, excellent teachers receive today, and even some not so excellent teachers. I was talking to Bruce before we started about, he was asking me about my next book, which don't tell Tess, but it's going to be from the Proverbs, and it's going to be touching on the prosperity gospel. And I said, I'm going to be taking aim at people like T.D. Jakes and Joel Osteen and who else?
Is Creflo Dollar, is he a pastor?
Oh, yes.
I hear the name, but I always thought that sounds fishy.
And
I've never seen him.
Hagen, what's his?
John Hagen.
Not John Hagen, it's...
Sure.
Anyway, there are a bunch of them out there.
Kenneth Copeland.
Huh?
Ken Copeland.
Kenneth Copeland, that's what I was thinking of. And Jim Baker was kind of the epitome of the prosperity preacher. But anyway, some very excellent teachers today receive kind of a hero worship, an overexalted sense of a person's worth. And I'm talking about people like John MacArthur, David Jeremiah, Chuck Swindoll. These are people that are very familiar to you. And these are, these are celebrity pastors. Now, let me tell you something. I sometimes wonder, and I've wondered about this, when you have a mega church like that, how much visiting do you actually do? Do you visit the sick? Are you there when a person has an operation to pray? That's what we always did in my church. We visited in the homes. We visited people in the hospital. And I've often wondered how much visiting does a Chuck Swindoll do? Now, maybe he does, I don't know. But with a large church like that, it seems that probably a lot of stuff is just delegated. Now, teachers in the ancient Mediterranean world were far more than just transmitters of tradition. They were models to be imitated in every walk of life. Now, do you remember what your homework assignment was last week? You were supposed to memorize the book of James so we could discuss it intelligently. Remember, I told you needed to memorize it in Greek? How many of you did that?
I don't want to show off though,
Oh, but you did.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to get up here and recite it?
I don't want to show off.
You don't want to show off, okay.
Bob, I tried, but it was all Greek to me.
Did anybody do it in English? No, of course not. That was actually a joke, when I said that. Yes, Danny.
I have a friend who actually did. His name was Jim, and he memorized the book of James.
In Greek? Or
No,
English?
in English.
Okay.
I'll
That's
be talking about him next week.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing to
But which
memorize
translation?
that is a very good thing to memorize Scripture. I set out, when I was a kid, I memorized hundreds of verses in the King James Version. But I also memorized the Sermon on the Mount. That would be a good thing to try to remember, to memorize. And I know when we get older, we forget things. Just the other week, I went to the pantry, and I'm standing there, and I said, now why am I here? And my wife says, why? Thank you. I said, don't tell me, I've got to figure it out myself. But have you ever done that where you get somewhere and you don't know why you're there? It's harder as we get older to memorize things, but remember what the psalmist said, thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against thee. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Or is it the other way around? A light unto my feet or a lamp unto my, whatever. Whatever, right.
A lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path.
Anyway,
Yes.
but these people in the ancient Mediterranean world were models to be imitated in every walk of life. Now, unfortunately, some modern radio and TV preachers do not have what I would call a holistic ministry. They may preach and do it very well. You know, if you've ever heard David Jeremiah or Chuck Swindoll or John MacArthur, excellent Bible teachers. But often they are so cloistered from the people that they teach that nobody really knows what they're doing behind the scenes or what they're really like behind the scenes. And I believe that, you know, if you're a pastor and you're not doing that, you're not really performing real ministry to your people. They're not providing a real model for people to follow. Now, I think what we can take away from this section is the awesome power of speech, not only for teachers, but for everyone. The awesome power of speech for either good or for ill. And a good teacher can do a lot of good. It really puffs me up a little bit, but I'm on Facebook and I have like over 1,000 former students of mine who are my friends. And every once in a while, I'll get one that says, "You were the greatest teacher ever." Which, you know, kind of makes up for the many that thought I was scum, you know. I was a very hard teacher, by the way. I was very demanding, and a lot of people didn't like that. But a teacher can do a lot of good. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, Proverbs 10:11. Gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones, Proverbs 16:24. A gentle answer turns away wrath, Proverbs 15:1. But speech can also be very destructive, can't it? A harsh word stirs up anger, Proverbs, I think it's 15:1. The mouth of a fool gushes folly, Proverbs 15:2. And a perverse tongue crushes the spirit, Proverbs 15:4. So we can also take away from this section the possibility of inconsistency. And I think that many of us are very inconsistent in our lives. We evangelicals, and everybody here, I would think, is an evangelical, is against such atrocities as abortion and euthanasia, and rightly so. They offend God deeply. I believe that God's view is that abortion is murder. But sometimes it doesn't seem to bother us so much that the poor and the outcast are abused or neglected. And that includes battered wives and homosexuals. We believers need to be consistent in our battle against sin and sinful behavior. But we also need to show love. All right. It's almost 10 o'clock and I am still standing. Isn't that amazing? 2 weeks ago I stood 10 minutes. Last week I stood 15 minutes. And here I am. I haven't been knocked out yet. So praise the Lord. Thank you for the prayers, by the way. Thank you so much. All right, verses 13 through 18. The NIV titles this section Two Kinds of Wisdom. And there is a false type of wisdom, and then there is a true type of wisdom. Now that sounds like Proverbs, doesn't it? Because the Proverbs says that there is the way of the wise man and the way of the fool. And so that's one reason why James is sometimes called the wisdom literature of the New Testament. So, verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Now, James begins this section by asking, who is wise and understanding among you? Lawrence, you don't need to let us know you are. It may seem to you that James is changing topics here from the tongue to two types of wisdom. But remember that control of the tongue is one of the most popular themes in Old Testament wisdom literature. And that's my area, by the way, is Old Testament wisdom literature. That's my area of real interest, scholarly interest. But there are two terms that are used here. The first one is the word that's used in the Greek for wise. Anybody want to take a guess what that term is? We get words from that. It's the word sophos. We get the word sophomore from that. And then we get the word understanding, which is almost interchangeable. So you have two Greek words that are used almost interchangeably. And James is likely using these terms to refer both to the leaders in the church as well as to the entire congregation. And by this rhetorical question, who is wise and understanding among you? James is asking congregations to evaluate themselves and to discern who are the truly wise people in their midst. These are people who both know what is right and practice what is right. And the NIV has an expression here, the humility that comes from wisdom, or the humility of wisdom, would have seemed to be an odd expression in the first century, wouldn't it? In this Hellenistic world. But humility, keep in mind that humility or meekness was not a respected trait in most Greek thought. Rebecca, it was so good seeing you.
It was good seeing
We love you.
too. Yeah.
Please come back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
But meekness or humility in the Greek world was not respected. The New Testament writers, however, followed the teaching of Jesus, and they understood meekness or humility to involve an understanding of our own unworthiness before God, and a corresponding humility and lack of pride in our dealings with one another. And according to James, for people to truly be wise, they must exhibit humility. All right, verse 14. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish doubt in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Now this verse presents a contrasting picture to the wise and understanding person of verse 13. This person is bitter and selfish. Now, the Greek here says, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts. In the Greek language, this is what is called a first-class condition. And what this means is that this assumes the truth of the condition. In other words, but if you harbor bitter anger and envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, and I assume that you do. Okay, that's really what it's saying. So apparently, there were many in the churches who were like this. Gee, who would have thought? Who would have thought it, right? But, and to top it off, these people in the church were arrogant about it. Now, we don't have arrogant people in the church, do we? Do we? This Greek word in the NIV translated selfish ambition was a very common one used by the Greeks to describe a person who was involved in partisan politics. You know anybody who is arrogant in politics?
You don't know anyone who's not.
It comes with the job description. A politician out to get votes is going to tell you anything. Remember George Santos? He told him all kinds of things. to get elected. And now it's turning out that none of it was true. He wasn't even a college graduate. Now, what James is implying, I think, is that the churches to whom he was writing had a rotten core of individuals, possibly in the key leadership positions, who were exhibiting these very attitudes. And apparently this problem was systemic in the church, and it was widespread among congregations. Now, probably the best way to see the last part of the verse is that these leaders were boasting of their wisdom. They were pridefully claiming wisdom that they did not possess. And if you want to know if a person possesses wisdom or not, if he's bragging about his wisdom, guess what? He doesn't have it. He doesn't have it. These people remind me of the mocker that the book of Proverbs talks about. You remember the book of Proverbs? It talks about the mocker. The mocker is not only a fool, but he is arrogant in his foolishness. You know, it's like the person who is an idiot and proud of it. You know somebody like that? You're nodding your heads. Yeah, I met him. I have one in my family. Verse 15. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is unearthly, unspiritual, of the devil. Now James identifies the true source of this kind of behavior. He says that it's not the wisdom that comes down from above. Remember back in chapter 1, verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from above. And what is that good gift in the context? It is wisdom. And James tells us that this wisdom that is selfish and jealous is not from God. It does not originate from God. It is earthly or earthbound. It does not come from heaven. It is also, he says here, natural or unspiritual. He uses the word psychikos, which is also used to describe the flesh. Now, finally, James describes this wisdom as, he uses the word diamonos, from which we get the word demon or demonic. And so it is earthbound, it is spiritually dead, it is demon instigated. And here we have the biblical source of that evil triad: the world, the flesh, and the devil. Now, here James gives us a reason in verse 16. He says, "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." Now, here James gives us a reason. Envy and selfish ambition does not strengthen the body of Christ. Rather, it leads to disorder and every evil practice. It opens the door to all manner of wickedness. And James leaves no room for people who seek their own glory within the church. If you're serving in the church for your own glory, you're doing it for the wrong reason. Now, let me just say this. I was a pastor, and I was a seminary professor and dean. And I know that church politics can get very ugly. Have any of you ever experienced church politics before? Nobody? Danny, you have? Okay, you have? Okay, it can get very ugly. And when we fight for power in Christian circles, evil establishes a foothold. And James says that it leads to disorder and chaos. And this kind of chaos does two things. First of all, it ruins the credibility of the church in the eyes of the world and the community. When you have a church split, it's there, and your sin is there for the whole world to see. And then secondly, it destroys the ability of the church to minister effectively to its own congregation. Verse 7, yeah.
Now, what about, I didn't know who George Santos was, so I looked it up while you were talking.
You didn't read about him?
I'm not watching the news.
Okay, yeah,
Purposely.
he's been in the news a lot.
But it's talking about bribery and then taking money, and I can think of a whole bunch of politicians that have done, sounds like way worse than that. And they're just laughing about it, so.
This is a very egregious case of where he lied about his credentials and he was elected on the basis of his credentials.
Well, it could be, but then you got a very egregious case of a laptop from 3 years ago with all kinds of crazy stuff on it that has been laughed off, you know. So,
Okay.
and then,
Well, I don't want to debate the merits of Biden or Santos. This is not a political class, but
no, I know that, but then you have the churches, so at some point you gotta stand up and say something.
yes.
But, you know, we split off 5-6 years ago, so maybe 6 or 7. The Methodists just split here 2 months ago
Yeah.
because of all this stuff. And you know, there's a right and wrong.
Well,
So,
I'm not talking about splits over doctrine, but I'm talking about like the church, the petty church splits where you have, well, there's an old joke, I'm going to go ahead and tell you about it. There were 6 people who were stranded on a desert island. There were 2 Roman Catholics, they started Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Church. There were 2 Presbyterians, they started the John Knox Presbyterian Church. And then there were 2 Baptists, they started First and Second Baptist Church.
I guess my point was, I think, you know, we can not take stuff lightly, but I think we're called to talk about bad stuff,
Yeah,
you know? We're not supposed to be just pacifistic and sit there and let bad stuff happen.
well, I think I'm going to stop here. We didn't quite get to verse 17. I was hoping we'd get through chapter 3 today, but are there any questions or comments, or anybody want to jump on Lawrence's conversation there? I don't mean to bring politics into the class. I'm just saying that, you know, when you have a politician, you have arrogant spirit, quite often. Yes?
How do you, is it our obligation to resist bad behavior without criticizing the person? Is it possible?
Well, Jesus gave us a way to do it. It's found in Matthew chapter 18. And that is, when you see bad behavior or sin in a person, you go to that person one-on-one. And if that person does not hear you, what's the second step, people?
Go to the elders.
Well, no, you take 1 or 2 other people so that you can establish it. And then you take it to the church, the elders. But there's a process that, and a lot of people are non-confrontational, and they don't want to deal with people like that. But that is our obligation. It's called, you know.
I think our church has had situations like that where they did exactly that. One-on-one and then a couple.
Well, that's the way that Jesus said we're supposed to deal with sin. One-on-one, and then 2 or 3 witnesses, and then the whole church. And then you're excommunicated.
But when it's not in the church,
Okay, somebody who's not in the church.
what's bothering me worse than anything is this group that is formed that is criticizing the Catholic Church and their faith. You know, you just sit by and look at it. How do you address it?
Well, there's a lot to criticize in the Catholic Church.
Well, but not the way they're doing it.
Okay, I don't know how they're doing it,
Hey,
but
you haven't seen the news.
what's going on?
I don't know what to talk about.
You don't,